Because of King's age and inexperience as an author, the books never really went public. However, I Was a Teenage Grave Robber was remembered for its graphic passages. One particular passage, consisting of maggots and a dead scientist, definitely proved King knew how to get the best of his reader. Most of King's writing was not this cinematically graphic, and work this graphic would later be turned down by his publishers because it didn't appeal to the public fiction genre enough to be successful. While writing his books, King tried to keep up with schoolwork and wrote for the school newspaper. He even wrote a parody of the paper with his issue of The Village Vomit. While his students found this funny, the administration found that he should be rewarded with a 3-day suspension. However, the school had decided to change the punishment to writing for the local sports page as a learning experience. John Good, the paper's editor, taught King that rewriting was one of the most important parts of writing and that nobody gets it right the first time. The rest of King's high school years involved football practice, which he felt obliged to join because of his size. However, King identified himself as an outsider. He described the high school society as a rigid class system in which there were only two groups, the winners and the losers. Chesley described King's high school life by saying, "I've always assumed that Stephen didn't have a wonderful high school experience, that it wasn't a great time for him in his life." However, high school ended soon enough, and in the spring of 1966, he attended the University of Maine, which he earned a scholarship for. He found himself adapting to the turbulent times of the 60s and 70s. King adapted to the dress and the activities of the politically active college student. He joined in protests of the war, chanting the slogan that became the symbol for the war protest, "Hell no, we won't go." Academically, King continued his career as a writer. During his freshman year, King completed his first full-length novel, The Long Walk. However, it was rejected from the publishing agent Random House. King took this as a serious blow and stored his book in his trunk. King's trunk was a place where all books that were rejected would stay, a common item among all novelists. However, King learned from his writing, and in the same year wrote The Sword in the Darkness. Although a better book, it was another failure. Besides the technical flaws, the book was 458 pages of unrelenting misery. When people look to read fiction, they don't necessarily want to depress themselves. Still driven, King continued to write through his college career, submitting to the school's literary magazine, Herbris, and the newspaper, The Main Campus. Upon graduation, King moved out into a cabin in Orono, Maine. He took up several jobs to support himself, but earning $1.25 pumping gas certainly wasn't cutting it. The only way he could get a little more cash was by applying his writing skills and publishing to the only people who would take it without question, men's magazines. Not the most glamorous publishing agent, but magazines like Cavalier would pay $200 to $300 for good stories about anything. On December 29, 1970, King and his girlfriend, who he had met in college, Tabitha Spruce, got married. After the first child, Naomi King, money got tight, and King tried to publish several books, such as Getting It On, a book about a student on the threshold of insanity. But nothing was accepted by the major publishers. King picked up an assistant teaching job, but it still wasn't enough. When Joseph was born into the family, even the phone had to be sold to save money. King would later recall, "I began to have long talks with myself at night about whether or not I was chasing a fool's dream." In a last-ditch effort to raise some cash, King wrote Carrie. With the help of editor William Thompson, Carrie's accepted with Doubleday printing. The book would earn an initial $400,000 in reprinting rights alone, $200,000 of which King would receive. King finally sold a major work, and this would be able to pull him out of his economic hardship as well. However, tragedy struck. On December 18, 1973, King's mother, whom King loved and cared for, passed away from cancer. Nellie King would only live long enough to witness Carrie's advance galleries. She would just be short of Carrie's publishing. After Carrie's great success, King followed up with Salem's Lot. This earned King an initial $250,000. This was easier to get published because now King was forming a name among the publisher. After these two books, King had trouble creating another good book. He was so close to becoming a bestseller but he couldn't create the vehicle to take him there. It wasn't until King's next major book he would reach the bestseller list. The next book would also receive Hollywood deals and become a known name among almost everyone to this day.
Here's Johnny!
The Shining brought in over $500,000 in subsidy rights alone and proceeded to sell 2.3 million copies. This was a huge success. King had reached the top as the book became a bestseller. King always felt the movie was a disappointment, however. It only received mixed reviews and had been significantly modified. Both King and his fans described the movie to not be true King work. It became the start of many movies that would end up being subpar compared to the books in public opinion. King was even able to add to his success with The Stand, and some may argue that it was the best book he ever wrote. King now had a name in writing, and King would discover that a name meant everything. King went back to his trunk and pulled out the long-forgotten Getting It On, which was retitled Rage, and The Long Walk. He published both under his pen name, Richard Bachman. Both novels flunked, but it was an interesting experiment because the results might have been different had it been known that the books were earlier works by King. Later, King was invited to the horror convention in Providence, Maine, now that he had a name. Providence, Maine happened to be the home of Lovecraft stories. He was excited to meet the writers who had inspired him to write as a kid. Authors like Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, and Frank Long had taught King about the craft. Despite all the publicity, King wanted to settle down. He had his phone number changed, and the operator was instructed to deter people's desperate cries for financial gifts, interviews, and advice on how to do away with their demonic neighbor who cursed the vegetable garden to succumb to root rot. King and Tabitha moved to Bagnor, Maine, where the two loved living. Both loved the area, the schools, and the fact that only the most diehard fans would bother making the trek to see him. For the next few years, Stephen King would write a book titled Danse Macabre, which would be an explanation on why he writes horror. The Birmingham News called it A Conversation with King. King used the book to try and connect with the readers. After Danse Macabre, he continued to write Pet Sematary, The Dead Zone, Firestarter, Cujo, and Different Seasons, which was a collection of novellas such as The Shawshank Redemption and Apt Pupil. It was during this time that the long-ignored addiction to alcohol began appearing as more and more of a problem. In fact, King says he doesn't even quite remember writing Cujo. His wife, family, and friends came to him with care and concern. King believed that he would need to conquer his addiction because too many writers before him drank themselves to death. With the help from his family, he eventually beat his addiction.